The day the village of Enderleen came to a halt was not because of a festival, nor a funeral, nor even a feast. It was because of a shameful spectacle that cut through its heart like a blunt knife. Everyone, young and old, came out to watch. From the dusty streets and crooked alleys, eyes followed in disbelief. The air was heavy with whispers that clung like smoke. There, in the very center of the village, a lonely widower despised by most handed over his coins for a young virgin named Amara, coins that her own family accepted with cold hands. It was, as the villagers said, the darkest transaction the place had ever swallowed. Amara, her beauty too fresh for sorrow, was traded like grain or livestock, branded with disgrace before she could even enter her youth. Some men chuckled with thirsty greed. Some women sneered with pity or disgust. "He has paid for a warm bed," they whispered. "Paid for life to crawl back into his lonely skin." Laughter spilled like poison, but no one stepped forward to stop it. Amara walked toward the clay house that would now be her prison, shoulders drooping as though the whole village pressed its weight against her back. Humiliation was inked into her skin more painfully than the hot sun above. She expected the same ending every girl feared: forced, broken, enslaved by a man whose only claim was his money. And yet, when the first night came, the thread of fate pulled differently. Inside those weathered clay walls, there was no violence, no hand raised against her, no cruelty spilling from lips. Instead, there was only a silence so heavy it seemed to carry its own sorrow. It was the sound of two broken souls breathing, the silence of a widower crushed by grief and gossip, and of a daughter sold by her family, carrying shame like a second name. Neither spoke, but both bled quietly in the hush. And so, what everyone had judged as filth and ruin became in secret the beginning of an unlikely alliance, one that would shake buried secrets, unravel the cruelty of her family, and in time, shift the balance of Enderleen forever. But it all began on that first night of silence. The moon was swollen and white, watching as Amara entered Quaim's house for the first time. The raw clay walls, cracked with years of rain and heat, seemed alive, staring at her as though judging her for stepping inside. Her shame weighed so heavily that her steps did not feel real. It was as if the ground tried to push her back out. The sound of the latch clicking behind her was louder than thunder. It sealed her fate like the lid of a coffin, final, cold, and unyielding. Kwame, the widower, said nothing. He did not leer, did not smile. He pointed instead at the wooden table, plain, scarred from years of use, where he had set a plate with fufu and a thin broth. His eyes avoided hers, staring not at her face but at the floor, as though the earth itself had become his only safe companion. After sitting silently for a few moments across from her, he rose, moving with the slowness of one carrying many invisible weights. The door to his bedroom creaked shut, leaving Amara alone with the meal and with silence that filled the night like smoke. Amara sat frozen, her body starved, her stomach hollowed by fear, yet her throat felt locked. She touched the food, but her hand refused to lift it toward her mouth. In that moment, she understood something chilling. She felt used without a single hand upon her. Shame had already touched her more cruelly than flesh could. Crickets sang outside while inside her chest was only emptiness. Tears slid from her eyes as if pulled by gravity, leaving her cheeks wet and her hands trembling. In the narrow room, Quaim lay sleepless on his worn mat. Faint shadows of his late wife, Abeni, moved in his mind as they had every night since the day he lost her. He remembered the smell of wet earth clutching the coffin, the faces around him lowering their eyes, and the silent judgment they carried. Your life has ended here. From then on, he walked the earth not as a whole man but a half, a figure of pity and ridicule. He had not bought Amara to fill the cave of his heart with love. He had bought her only to silence the cruel laughter of the village that mocked him as shriveled, dried, destined to rot alone. But Amara was no less haunted. On her side of those cracked clay walls, her sobs trickled out quietly into her hands. She feared he might hear, feared punishment, but her grief was a storm she could not strangle. Each sob carried memories of her family's betrayal. She remembered her mother's voice, the one that once sang lullabies, now sharp as poison. "You're no good to us anymore. At least you'll bring money," sold like livestock, packaged as shame, shoved into the arms of a stranger. That memory burned her more than any wound ever could. In the middle of the night, unable to sleep, Amara rose. She walked in bare feet along the cold, uneven floor. Her fingers brushed along the cracks in the walls, touching the rough skin of the house. The silence was so vast it echoed inside her as if mocking her loneliness. Slowly she stopped outside the door of Quaim's room. On the other side, he lay awake as well. He heard the faint, ghost-like hush of her footsteps, Neither dared to speak, neither dared to move. A thin wooden door held between them the thickest wall of all. Two people drowned in loneliness, unaware their grief was the same. Dawn arrived gently, its first light spilling through gaps in the window. Quame opened his door to find Amara curled on the floor, hugging her knees against her chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand obedience or smile with triumph. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, broke off a piece of yam, and placed it silently on the table. Then he led his body out into the garden, letting the gesture speak where words refused to form, and so she ate, slowly, without joy, chewing with the acceptance of someone who knows choices no longer belong to her. Meanwhile, the village buzzed with foul gossip. Women snickered by the wells. Has he touched her yet? Or has he lost his strength along with his wife? Men in drinking circles jeered. Kwame bought a shadow, less than a woman, not worth the bread. But none of them knew what truths were quietly forming behind those walls. For inside that clay home, silence was not just emptiness. It began shaping itself into a strange connection. Where others saw filth and foolishness, a fragile thread of solidarity was silently spun between two wounded souls. For days, nothing more happened. Only thick silence, stiffness, and quick glances that fled before they landed. Yet even without words, something invisible grew. Beneath the weight of silence, they both felt a thin line drawing them together, like two trees leaning across dry soil, each in need of the other's shadow. What had started as a transaction steeped in humiliation became instead the first seed of a story that would later change not only their fates but an entire village. The following days still bore silence. Amara walked softly through the house, head bent, chest tight. She felt, even behind closed doors, as though the villagers were watching, still holding her on trial. But slowly, she came to understand the reason behind Quame's stern eyes. One afternoon, while cleaning, she noticed portraits on the main wall. 3 simple wooden frames hung, each carrying the faded smile of a Baini, the dead wife who had filled this space with warmth long before Amara's arrival. Everywhere Amara looked, the ghost of a Baini remained. A mat woven by her hands, an iron pot carefully preserved, a scarf folded like precious silk upon the headboard. Every object whispered, this was once hers. You are but an intruder in her house. She stopped before the portraits, staring into a Baini's gentle yet sorrowful eyes. Shame struck her again, whispering, if she was good enough, what are you? A sold girl, a bought shadow. And as she stood there frozen, Kwame entered. At first his face hardened, her eyes where they did not belong, her body standing under the smile of his wife. But then came a heavy sigh, and his voice, broken but steady. She was my wife. The only love I ever knew. Amara dropped her gaze. She expected rebuke. She expected to be told never to touch anything again. Yet instead he added, when she died, half of me was buried with her, and the neighbors pitied me. They laughed. He'll never hold another woman, they said. In that fragile moment, Amara learned that his harshness was not contempt for her body, but a scar carved by grief. His cold gaze was not rejection of her as a human, but blindness caused by memory's grip. That night, Amara wept differently. She remembered her own mother's words, the betrayal that spit her value as coins, and she saw what bound them. He had been abandoned by death. She had been abandoned by the living. Different wounds, same loneliness. From then, she began small gestures. One day she cleaned the living room, dusted the portraits, swept the clay floor, and placed fresh flowers in a small gourd beneath a Baini's picture. When Kwame returned and saw, his silence was longer than usual. His eyes glistened in ways he tried to hide. Amara bowed her head again, but he understood. She hadn't come to erase a Baini. She had come to share the weight of her absence. Appeared in the doorway, his eyes were tired yet alert. He said nothing, just waited. Amara took a deep breath, and Ina's trembling voice began. I need to tell you the truth. The truth about why I was sold. Didn't move. He simply leaned against the doorframe and looked at her intently, as if her words were stones falling into a deep well. Amara lowered her eyes, and the tears came before she could even finish the sentence. I was given away because my family always said I was a useless burden. My mother used to say I wasn't good for bringing pride or wealth. When they began to starve, they said the only thing of value I had was my virginity, and they sold me as if I were a goat. With every word, her body trembled. She expected contempt, maybe cold silence, maybe our response that confirmed the shame she carried. But Kame remained still, his eyes serious, and then he spoke in a deep and measured voice. I was once a burden too, even to myself. Amara looked up, surprised. It wasn't the response she expected. There was pain in his confession, but also recognition. For the first time, someone wasn't judging her or reducing her to the price paid. For the first time, someone was saying, "I know that dark place where you live." She sat down in front of him, not realizing she was moving closer than she ever had before. She told him details of her childhood, how her sisters were praised while she was hidden away, how she never received a gift, only criticism, how her own mother looked at her with indifference. Each memory was an open wound, and that night she revealed them without fear. Listened in silence, but in his eyes there was something new. Not just compassion, but recognition. When she finished, he said, "I too have known the weight of abandonment. When Abini died, everyone said it was time to start over, but no one stayed. No friends, no family, only loneliness remained on the neighbors' laughter. And for many years, I believed I was worth nothing." His words entered Amara like balm. It was as if two different stories had met at the same point. Rejection. And in that meeting, something stronger than pity was born: understanding. She cried, but it wasn't the cry of despair. It was the cry of someone who has finally found someone who knows the same pain. And Kwa, for the first time in a long while, didn't feel weak for admitting his wound. On the contrary, he realized that on that night he was sharing a burden he no longer had to carry alone. Outside, the village continued with its sharp tongues, spreading poison. But inside that clay house, in the silence of night, an invisible bond began to form. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't a promise of the future, but it was the mutual recognition of two rejected souls who had found one another. And so in that unexpected confession, Amara ceased to be just the bought one and became Tuwami, someone with a story, with pain, with truth. From that night on, they were no longer just man and merchandise. They were two survivors of the same wound, sharing the same roof, and little by little, the same hope. Weeks passed, and even with the weight of gossip sweeping through the village like dirty wind, Amara began to carry herself differently. She no longer walked hunched over like on that first day she crossed the gate into Kwa's home. Now, when she fetched water from the river, or helped carry produce from the garden to the market, her steps had more firmness, and her eyes no longer hid as much. There was still pain, still shame, but a thread of dignity had begun to grow in her chest. The market was the heart of Nadine village. There, one could find everything: fresh vegetables, colorful fabrics, spices brought from a brand, of course. The made-up stories multiplied at every stall. It was also the stage where many people's honor was tested. It was in this setting, before everyone, that fate decided to put Wayne and Amara to the test. That day, the sun was high and the dust clung to the skin. Carried a heavy basket of pumpkins and tomatoes, while Amara held a small bundle of grains. They walked side by side in silence when a group of men began to laugh loudly upon seeing them. One of them, named Bantinown for his insolent tongue and hands that had never worked the land, approached with a mocking air. "Look at this," he said, drawing the others' attention. "The widower hour even bought himself a girl's virginity. But tell me, what's the worth of a sold virgin? Not even half the cattle we raise." The laughter of his companions echoed through the market. The women nearby stopped picking through goods just to watch. Amara felt her face burn. The shame was so intense, she thought about dropping the basket and running back home. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled. She had heard many cruel words before, but here, in front of the entire village, it was as if her wound were being exposed for all to see. Then something unexpected happened. Who always remained silent, raised his voice. His posture was firm, his eyes locked onto the man who mocked. In a deep voice, he spoke so that everyone could hear. "She's worth more than your filthy mouth." Silence fell like a thunderclap. The entire market froze. The laughter that had echoed moments ago ceased instantly, and even the crickets seemed to fall silent. No one expected Kwam, the hardened, quiet man, to raise his voice like that. Bantao tried to cover it up with a nervous laugh, but the weight of Kwa's words had already marked everyone present. Amara stood frozen. No one had ever defended her in public. She had always been treated like a burden, a nuisance, something disposable. But in that moment, before everyone, someone had lifted her above the insults. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of emotion. She raised her head, and for the first time since arriving at Kwa's house, dared to face the village. She felt alive. She felt like someone. The label of sold was still there, but it was no longer the only name she carried. Now there was dignity too. The women whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disapproval, but others murmured quietly, "Maybe it's not just a transaction. Maybe there's something different between them." Bantao, embarrassed, stepped back, trying to laugh again. But his voice no longer held power. The mark left that day was clear. The solitary widower hour had chosen to defend that young woman before everyone, and that changed everything. On the way back home, The silence between them was different. It was no longer the heavy silence of shame, but the silence of those who had much to say and didn't know where to begin. As they approached the gate, Amara stopped, looked at him, and whispered, her voice low but full of truth. "Thank you." Didn't respond. He simply kept walking as if nothing had happened. But inside him, something stirred. He realized he hadn't just defended her from an insult. He had also defended himself, his own decision to no longer live in emptiness. That night when Amara lay down, his words echoed like a song in her mind. "She's worth more than your filthy mouth." It was the first time she fell asleep, with a faint smile on her lips. And so in that public defense, before the entire market, the invisible bond between them began to become visible to the village. They were no longer just man and merchandise. They were companions in a battle against shame. Time moved forward, and the relationship between Kwame and Amara began to take on shapes. No one could have foreseen. What was once only uncomfortable silence had transformed into small gestures of cure almost imperceptible yet full of meaning. However, it was in a moment of weakness when Kwame's health faltered that the true depth of the bond between them was revealed. It all began on a heavy morning when the sun had not yet fully risen. Kwame got up to tend the garden as he did every day. But as he lifted the hoe, he felt his body give out. A cold sweat broke across his forehead, and the legs that once stood firm like baobab trunks now trembled like thin branches. Amara, who was sweeping the yard, ran at the sound of the hoe hitting the ground. She found him kneeling, trying to hide his weakness. "Let me help you," she said, frightened. Kwame tried to stand on his own, but staggered. His pride wouldn't let him accept help, but his body no longer obeyed. It was Amara who held him by the shoulders and led him back into the house, nearly dragging his weight with the fragile strength of her own body. She sat him down on the mat and rushed to the kitchen to boil water with herbal leaves she had learned to use in childhood. For days Wayne remained bedridden, worn down by fever. The village whispered that it might be the end for the old widower hour. Many said Amara would take the chance to run away, that she had no reason to stay beside a sick man, especially one who had bought her. But the village didn't know the young woman's heart. Amara never left his side. She spent sleepless nights changing wet cloths on his forehead, preparing light soups with the little they had, feeding him spoon by spoon. She held his hand when the fever threatened to drag him away, murmuring short prayers, asking the ancestors to give him more time. One early morning when the fever was at its worst, Walma opened his eyes with difficulty and saw Amara lying on the floor beside his mat, exhausted but still holding his hand, and in that moment, he heard her whisper words that pierced him like an arrow. "You didn't buy me, you found me." The phrase echoed in his mind even as the fever returned. They were simple words, yet they carried the deepest truth. For the first time, Kwame realized that the young woman wasn't there. Out of obligation, she wasn't just fulfilling a fate imposed on her. She was there by choice, out of care, out of a loyalty that no coin could ever buy. When the fever finally broke, and Kwame managed to stand still, Wiki looked at Amara in a new way. There were tears in his eyes. He, who had always hidden pain behind hardness, now let emotion overflow. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. He simply held her hand firmly, and in that silent gesture, Amara understood something new had been born. Meanwhile, in the village, the story spread. Some mocked, saying Amara was a fool for wasting her nights caring for an old man. Others, however, began to look at her with respect. They said, "She doesn't look like a servant. She looks like a wife." In that clay house, marked by loneliness and the contempt of others, the unexpected had happened. In place of a purchase contract, a gift of care was born. In place of shame, loyalty took root. Kame, still recovering, realized that life had given him a second chance, not for wealth, not for status, but for silent love. A love born not from words, but from Amara's devotion, night after night, when no one else believed in him. And so her unexpected gesture transformed Kwame's heart. From a man hardened by loss and scorn, he began to become someone capable of feeling again. Amara, the young woman once rejected and sold as a useless burden, proved herself greater than any rumor in the village. There, in that quiet care, both discovered that true strength is born when two weaknesses meet and choose to stay. After Kwa's illness and Amara's tireless care, the clay house that had once been silent began to take on a new rhythm. There were no open declarations of love, but there was respect, companionship, and a serenity not often found in other homes in the village. The whole community was beginning to notice that something different was happening there. But just when peace seemed possible, Amara's past came knocking, bringing with it its cruelest shadow, her own family. It was late afternoon when the dust from the road announced unexpected visitors. 3 men and a woman, relatives of Armor, appeared at the door. Their faces carried no remorse. No longing, only the cold ambition of those who return because they smell opportunity. Theodor's sister Nia was the first to speak, her voice loud and commanding. "This girl still belongs to us. We sold her virginity, not her whole life. If he wants her longer, he'll have to pay more." Amara felt the ground slip beneath her feet. The words were like knives ripping through old wounds. There was no apology, no gesture of affection. Only the same contempt that had followed her since childhood. She lowered her eyes, trying to hold back tears, while the memory of the last time she saw her mother echoed in her mind. "You're a useless burden. At least bring us some money." Wayne, upon hearing the demand, stood still for a moment. Then he rose with purpose, eyes blazing. He walked to the door and faced Amara's relatives like a warrior staring down enemies in open field. His voice, deep and cutting, broke the silence. "Those who sell blood don't deserve an inheritance." The words hit like a stone to the heart. Nia tried to argue, but Kwame stepped forward and continued. "You cast her off like dead weight. I didn't buy merchandise. I welcomed her into my home, and here she belongs to no one. Not to me, and certainly not to you." The neighbors, already gathering out of curiosity from the noise, witnessed the scene. Murmurs spread. Some chuckled with anticipation, hoping for drama. Others watched in silence, recognizing that this was no longer the story of a sold girl, but the fight of a man and a woman for dignity. Amara, who until then had remained withdrawn, felt a strength rise within her. For the first time, she raised her voice to her own family. She looked into Nia's eyes and spoke with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I don't belong to you. I never did. If you didn't want me as a daughter, you won't have me now as property." The words echoed with power, and the silence of the crowd grew heavy. Her sister, offended, tried to step closer, but the king raised his arm and stopped her. The man once seen as fragile, old, and solitary now stood as an unshakable protector. Amara's relatives, faced with resistance, and the Ville's watchful eyes had no choice but to back off. They left with insults, vowing to return, but the damage was already done in the eyes of the community. Amy and Amara were no longer objects of mockery. They had become symbols of justice. That night the clay house was silent, but not the heavy silence of those early days. It was the silence of relief. Amara, sitting by the oil lamp, let the tears flow. But this time they weren't of pain. They were of liberation. For the first time, she looked at herself without feeling only shame. Sitting nearby, watched her quietly. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence said it all. When Amara looked up, she found something new in his eyes. Not just protection, but recognition. She was no longer the bought one. She was a companion, a partner, someone whose worth could never be measured in coins. The village, which had witnessed the entire scene, whispered the next day. "He drove her family out like thieves," said. "Those who sell blood don't deserve inheritance. We've never heard anything like it." And others murmured with respect. "Maybe that girl isn't ashamed, but justice beneath that roof." Their turn of her cruel family, which could have been another wound, became a sign of liberation. It was in front of everyone that Amara broke the last chain, tying her to the past, and it was in front of everyone that Kami showed his home was not a place of trade, but of dignity. What had happened at Kwam's doorstep spread through the village faster than fire through dry straw. For days, there was no other topic of conversation. Some said Kami had become insolent, daring to confront the young woman's own family. Others, in silence, held respect for his courage. But above all, Amara's figure began to be seen with new eyes. She was no longer just the sold virgin. She was the woman who, in the face of humiliation, had the courage to raise her voice and say, "I never belonged to you." That moment marked the beginning of a change no one could have foreseen. The young woman who had arrived with her head down, carrying the label of useless burden, began to bloom. Slowly, Amara started to take up space in community life. At first, timidly, she offered to teach some girls how to sew using fabric scraps she managed to gather at the market. She would gather them under the shade of a large tree, and there, with needle and thread, she taught not only how to join fabric, but also how to cultivate patience and discipline. The girls, once seen only as future wives and servants, began to feel important for learning something new. They took their small creations home, and their mothers, surprised, began to recognize a special gift in Amara. Each afternoon, more girls would show up. It didn't take long for older women to begin joining them as well. Wanting to learn how to mend clothes or even saw simple bags to sell at the market, the transformation was visible. Where once stood a humiliated girl, now stood a patient teacher, someone who offered dignity through simple skills. The talk in the village changed in tone. Who would have thought? The bought one became a role model. But it wasn't just sewing that changed her image. Amara also began helping women read short passages from old books Kame had kept from his late wife. Little by little, women who had once remained silent began to pronounce words they had never understood before. That simple, slow literacy work brought a new light to the eyes of those who had carried only resignation. That gesture sparked something greater. The awareness that they were not just mouths to feed or hands to work. They were minds. They were voices. They were women with worth, and it was Amara who lit that flame. With each gathering, the shadow of shame grew smaller. Even the children began running to Kwa's house, eager to hear the stories Amara told between lessons. The same village that had once despised her began to frequent that space with respect. Some men still whispered mockery under their breath. But even they couldn't deny that something powerful was happening there. Who had always lived as a shadow would watch the gatherings from a distance and smile quietly. In Amara, he saw not just the young woman fate had brought into his life, but a force he had never imagined existed. And within him grew the certainty that this woman had not been bought. She had been gifted to him by chance or perhaps by something greater. The village's venom, once uncontrollable, began to lose its grip. Even Zareth, a neighbor who had spread so many rumors, no longer found an audience for her malice. The women now preferred to speak of new skills, small victories, and daughters learning to sew or read. The gaze that once held only disdain now carried a hint of envy mixed with respect. At the market, the comments had changed. That young woman is no longer merchandise. She's become a root. If she was once sold, now she's the one giving value to others. The ville's transformation was underway. The village, of course, added new poison. By the riverbank, women cackled. He fills his house with ghosts, the dead wife and the bought girl. Laughter shook their bodies, and rumors traveled. Amara heard, and though her stomach twisted, she no longer broke like that first night. In Quame's eyes lived the same pain her own chest carried. And in that recognition, compassion began its quiet work. In that still house, haunted by memories, the first fragile thread of connection had been woven. What the villagers saw only as disgrace was in truth a stirring of something new. A seed of life sprouted in the soil of grief. Routine dragged forward, silence still thick, but like the earth, life always insists on pushing through cracks. Quame woke before dawn to wrestle with the land that never gave food freely. His hoe struck dry soil, sweat rolling down his chest as the sky grew pale above. Amara began joining him, at first only as an observer. She sat by the doorstep, small and watchful, gazing at the man who turned dust into grain. She had been sold to him, but slowly she began to see more than just her captor. She began to see effort, survival, the stubborn labor of endurance. One morning, without commands or words, Amara rose and carried the basket of clothes down to the river. She knelt by the stones, scrubbing her fingers raw. She pounded the cloth, rinsed it in cold water, wrung it out with trembling hands, copying the rhythm of the village women who gossiped but had never lifted a hand for her. She walked down to the river and spent hours scrubbing each piece on the stone, beating, rinsing, and wringing them out, just as she had seen the other women of the village do. When she returned, she hung the clean clothes on a makeshift rope line. When Wami came back from the garden, he noticed the movement and frowned as if about to scold her. But when he saw the clothes swaying in the wind, clean and fresh, he remained silent. For the first time, he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible. But to Amara, it meant more than any words. Little by little, a routine was born. Amara took care of the house. She swept the clay floor, prepared small meals, organized the few utensils. In turn, tended the land with even more dedication. They didn't agree on anything. It just happened, as if a silent instinct guided every gesture. And in that quiet rhythm, the weight of loneliness began to fade. The first time Amara cooked for him, the tension was high. She placed on the table a plate of thickened beans with pieces of sweet potato. Wami came in, washed his hands in silence, and sat down. She expected a comment, a complaint, maybe even disdain, but he simply ate everything, not leaving a single bite. When he finished, he looked up and said in a deep, brief voice, "It's good." That simple phrase made Amara's heart tremble. It wasn't open praise. It wasn't declared affection, but it was recognition. After so many years of being treated as a useless burden by her own family, those two words felt like balm. In the village, the whispers began to shift as well. Neighbors passing by the house saw Amara hanging clothes or carrying water in a pot and whispered to each other, "She doesn't look like a slave. She looks like a housewife." Some spoke with contempt, others with surprise, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Was there something more than a mere transaction in that house? One afternoon, Quame returned from the garden with a basket full of tomatoes and small pumpkins. Instead of leaving the basket in the corner, as he always did, he placed it in front of Amara and said, "Pick the best ones for the pot." It was the first time he shared the fruits of his labor with her. Amara, with careful hands, selected the firmest ones and washed them with attention. Meanwhile, he watched her from a distance, and a thought crossed his mind. She has her own way. She's not a shadow, not the dead. She's alive. In that shared rhythm of divided tasks, an invisible thread began to bind them. There were no laughs yet, no declarations, but there was partnership. Amara started to realize she wasn't being treated like an object. There were no shouts, no commands, no impositions. And Wami in silence began to feel the weight of solitude lighten in the village. The cruelest comment still echoed. Love doesn't grow from purchase. But inside that clay house, unnoticed by all, something stronger than any contract was beginning to take root. A shared routine built from small gestures, quiet moments, and a dignity slowly being rebuilt. And so, among washed clothes and tended gardens, the two who began as commodity and buyer started to see each other as survival companions. It was the first step of a journey the village would never have imagined witnessing. No story of transformation unfolds without envy finding a way to poison it. In the village of Enderalini, where every gesture was watched as if it were a spectacle, the quiet bond between Kame and Amara began to stir even louder murmurs. If at first the mockery was filled with disdain, over time it shifted into malicious curiosity. Some waited for the girl to run away, others believed Kwam would soon mistreat her, and many hoped the arrangement would end in scandal. Among the women, the most vicious in spreading venom was Zuri, Kwa's neighbor, known for her sharp tongue and a heart hardened by jealousy. She couldn't stand seeing Amara walking through the market with her head held high, helping Kame carry baskets of vegetables or picking out simple fabrics to sew. Zuri would say aloud, unafraid of being overheard, "It's nothing but a deal. Love doesn't grow from a transaction." The words burned like hot iron in Amara's chest. As much as she tried to ignore them, each syllable seemed to confirm the brand she had carried since she was sold, that of being just a commodity. At home, she kept silent, hiding the pain. But here Yeez, which had started to regain some light, became sad again. Noticed he was not a man of sweet words, but he was observant. One afternoon, he found Amara standing in front of the clay stove, stirring the pot without even looking at the food. Her expression was distant, as if her mind were elsewhere. He approached and asked in his deep voice, "What did they say to you?" She took a while to answer. Only after a long silence did she murmur that it's just a deal, that I'll never be more than that. Took a deep breath. His old habit would have been to stay quiet, to pretend nothing touched him. But something inside him shifted, perhaps because he recognized in Amara the same wound he had once carried. When everyone mocked his loneliness, he raised his face and said firmly, "Deal's end. What we have is just beginning." Amara looked up, surprised. It was the first time she heard something from his lips that felt like a promise. It wasn't a declaration of love, nor a vow, but it was a statement that broke the heavy silence around them. And in that short sentence, for the first time, she believed she might not be just an object. That, perhaps there was room for her to be someone real in that house. Meanwhile, Zuri didn't stop. She spread rumors through every corner of the village. She said Amara was nothing but a quiet mouth and a warm bed, that Kwa would never present her as a wife, that soon she'd be discarded. The words dropped like poison into curious ears. But at the same time, another perception began to emerge among some neighbors. Watching Amara care for children by the riverbank or share food with poorer women, they saw in her an unexpected generosity, and that disturbed those who longed to see her fall. One day at the market, Zuri spoke loud enough for all to hear. "That girl is nothing. She was sold like a goat cheese, worth no more than what was paid for her." Amara felt her face burn. She wanted to hide, but before she could take a step, moved ahead. He looked Zuri straight in the eye, and his voice rang through the market. "A deal is what you make when you trade food for coins. What we have here is life, and life has no price." The silence that followed was heavy. Some laughed nervously, others lowered their heads. Zori tried to respond, but the weight of Kwa's words left her speechless. Amara moved, lifted her eyes before the entire village. For the first time, she wasn't alone in her defense. That night, lying in her corner, she repeated his words to herself. "Deal's end. What we have is just beginning." They were simple words, but they became a foundation in her heart. If until then she had lived as a commodity, now she had found a spark of worth that no one could extinguish. And so, even with the poison spreading through the village, something stronger was growing inside that house. Contempt still lingered, but it no longer held the same power. What Aim and Amara were starting to build wasn't rooted in gossip, but in small, honest gestures no one could deny. The nights in Kwa's house were always quiet, interrupted only by the distant song of crickets or the barking of the village dogs. Amara had grown used to falling asleep with a heavy heart, waiting for the next day without knowing what it would bring. But that night, unlike the others, the weight in her chest was so heavy that she couldn't close her eyes. She sat upon the mat and stared at the weak flame of the oil lamp, feeling that something inside her needed to come out. She had kept a secret for too long, one that gnawed at her, and each unspoken word felt like a knot in her throat. Then, gathering her courage, she gently knocked on Kwa's bedroom door. He took a while to answer. When he finally... Amara didn't need to shout. She didn't seek revenge. It was through patience, generosity, and sharing that she achieved what no one thought possible: respect. And so, the bot girl became a teacher. The woman rejected by her own family became a source of dignity for other women. What began in humiliation was now seen as an example. And the entire village, even if not openly admitting it, had already begun to bow to the silent strength of the young woman who dared to rewrite her own story. The changes in the village of Nadel had become impossible to ignore. What had once been cruel gossip had turned into living testimony. Amara, the young woman once sold like property, was now seen as an example of dignity and strength. Her sewing and literacy lessons had awakened a new sense of purpose among the women. And even the men, those still silently resistant, no longer dared to mock her in public. But the greatest gesture was yet to come, the one that would seal once and for all the new story that Amara and were writing together. It was late afternoon, and the sky was painted red when made a decision that surprised even himself. For years, he had lived imprisoned by the memories of his late wife, carrying the weight of loneliness and the shame the village had cast upon him. Now, however, he saw before him not a shadow, but a companion who had healed wounds he never thought could mend. He could no longer allow the village to whisper that she was just the bought one. He needed to show everyone that the bond between them had no price. So, gathered his courage, and went to the village elders, asking them to call the people for a gathering in the central square. The news spread quickly, and soon the murmurs filled the homes. Wam is going to speak in public. What could he be planning? Some expected a fight. Others thought perhaps he was announcing his departure. No one, however, suspected the truth. On the appointed day, the square was full. Men, women, and children gathered, curious. Quame appeared in simple clothes, but stood tall. At his side, Amara walked with calm steps, holding a small cloth embroidered by her own hands. Silence fell as they reached the front, took a deep breath, and began to speak in his deep voice. For years, I was known as the lonely widower. They laughed at me, mocked my grief, and said I would die alone. When Amara came to my home, many said it was a dealer purchase, that there was no dignity in what I had done. Maybe at the beginning, even I believed that, but time showed me something else. The crowd listened closely. Some elders nodded while younger villagers murmured among themselves. Amara kept her eyes on the ground, her heart pounding. Quame continued, lifting his gaze. Today I speak before you all. I did not buy her. Today I ask for her hand, not as property but as a gift, not as a deal, but as a choice. Amara, will you be my wife before God in this village? The silence that followed was so deep, you could hear the wings of a bird fluttering in the distance. Amara slowly raised her eyes and tears streamed down her face. For so long she had carried the mark of rejection, the weight of humiliation, the pain of being treated as an object. Now before the entire village, the same man who had once received her as a purchase was recognizing her as a gift. With a trembling but steady voice, she answered, "Yes, I want to be your wife." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some in disbelief said nothing. Others moved, wiped away tears in silence. Even the harshest among them, who had long mocked Quame, could not find the strength to laugh. For the first time, the whole village fell into a respectful silence. An old village elder, known for her wisdom, stood and spoke. What began in shame ends in honor. May this union be remembered as proof that destiny may delay, but it never fails the righteous. The people then began to applaud, and some lifted their voices in simple songs, as if blessing the moment. That night, Amara and Kame returned home no longer as buyer and bought, but as husband and wife. The entire village had witnessed the transformation. What once was a contract had become love. What was once humiliation had become respect, and from that day on, no one dared call Amara a commodity again. Her name was now spoken with reverence, as that of a woman who, with patience and dignity, transformed a man's fate, and along with it the fate of an entire village. The public wedding of Wame and Amara was not just the union of two lives. It was a turning point that forever changed the heart of the village of Endolini. Those who once mocked, those who had repeated that love cannot grow from a transaction were forced into silence by what they witnessed. A man hardened by grief, and a young woman rejected by her own family, sealing their union not with coins, but with dignity. In the days that followed, the transformation was visible. Amara, once labeled the bought one, became a respected matriarch. Her voice, once too timid to be heard, now led women's gatherings, taught young girls to sew, to read, and most importantly, to believe in themselves. Every girl who held a needle under her guidance learned more than a skill. She learned that her worth was not measured by dowry or marriage, or the poisonous words of those who could not see beyond appearances. Wami in turn experienced the freedom that only unexpected love can bring. The man who once lived in silence, imprisoned by memories of his late wife and by the villages, Scornell walked with steady steps, and his head held high, not from pride, but because he had found peace. The weight of loneliness had been replaced by gratitude. At Amara's side, he discovered that life still had meaning even after pain, and the village, which had so often delighted in the humiliation of others, learned a lesson that would echo for generations. People began to understand that dignity does not come from status, wealth, or origins. Dignity is built through choices, through how one chooses to treat others, through the courage to stand up against injustice even when silence is expected. Even the children retold the story as if it were an ancestral tale. She was sold by her family but became mother of the village. He was called a useless old man but found new life beside her. And with every retelling, the power of that story grew, becoming part of the village's collective memory. Amara's relatives, those who once called her a useless burden, ever again dared to claim her. Their shame had been made public, and Quame's declaration, "Those who sell blood deserve no inheritance," was etched into memory like a proverb. Whenever someone tried to dishonor family ties out of greed, those words were remembered as a warning. Amara over time became a symbol, not just Kwa's wife, but a woman who turned rejection into strength, pain into roots, silence into voice. Many came to her home not Tomuk, but to seek advice, to hear a word of comfort, to find inspiration, and she with humility welcomed them all. What had begun as a purchase, as humiliation, ended as a testimony of love. The kind of love not announced with flowers or empty promises, but built through care, through respect, and through the courage to stay. The kind of love that grows in silence, endures in suffering, and blossoms when least expected. Huam and Amara grew all together side by side, not as buyer and bought, but as husband and wife, as companions in life. And the whole village, which once laughed and mocked, now bowed before them, not in servitude, but in respect. And so the story of a lonely widower hour and a rejected young woman became living proof that even from injustice redemption can be born, that even from rejection love can bloom, that even from pain hope can rise. In the memory of the village of Endeline, the story would remain forever. A reminder that a destiny may begin in shame but end in honor. Because as the elders would say, destiny may delay, but it never fails the righteous. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us keep bringing you real,